The rain in Oakland never washed anything clean. It only rearranged the filth, pushing the grime deeper into the cracks of the pavement, filling the gutters with the residue of broken promises and abandoned lives. 19-year-old Cassidy Mercer sat shivering in the driver's seat of her stalled 1998 Ford Taurus, as staring through the rain-streaked windshield at the neon sign flickering across the street. Blackstone Motors. The red letters buzzed and stuttered against the black sky like a heartbeat threatening to flatline. Everyone in the neighborhood knew what the garage really was. A fortress. A sanctuary heavily tied to the Iron Reapers Motorcycle Club, one of the most feared outlaw organizations on the West Coast. Cops drove past it without slowing down. Families crossed the street to avoid walking along its chain-link perimeter. But Cassidy was not a family anymore. She was not a citizen with a mailbox and a front door and someone waiting inside to ask how her day went. She was a hungry, abandoned ghost with 3 crumpled dollar bills in the center console and a padlocked apartment door somewhere behind her that she would never open again. The smell of stale cigarettes and cheap vanilla air freshener had permanently seeped into the upholstery of the Taurus. It was the smell of her childhood, the smell of her mother's perfume mixed with neglect. The car had been her home for exactly 17 days. That was the precise number of sunrises since her mother Jolene had emptied their joint bank account down to the last cent, packed a single duffel bag, and vanished into the California fog without so much as a note on the kitchen counter. Just gone. Like smoke through a screen door. Well, Cassidy was used to her mother's disappearing acts. The 3-day benders, the new boyfriend who was always going to change everything, the promises made in the amber glow of the kitchen light at 2 a.m. But this was different. This was not a temporary absence. This was surgical. Jolene had cut every thread that connected them and cauterized the wound behind her. The landlord had shown up 4 days later with an eviction notice and a locksmith who changed the deadbolt while Cassidy stood on the sidewalk holding a garbage bag full of clothes. Desperation had a taste. It tasted like copper pennies and the last dregs of cold gas station coffee. Cassidy wiped the condensation from the inside of the windshield with the sleeve of her oversized gray sweatshirt and studied the garage across the street. Blackstone Motors was massive. An imposing cinder block fortress that swallowed half a city block, its corrugated steel doors pulled shut against the weather. Outside, a row of immaculate custom-built motorcycles stood in formation beneath a rusted metal awning, their chrome catching the fractured neon light like the polished armor of sleeping war machines. She needed a job. The diners along International Boulevard were not hiring. The retail stores on Telegraph Avenue wanted a permanent address, a phone number that was not disconnected, and a smile that did not look like it belonged to someone who had been sleeping in a car. Her stomach had been eating itself for 2 days. She had one marketable skill. She knew engines. She had spent her teenage years keeping her mother's rotating collection of dying vehicles alive using junkyard parts, stolen tools, and a stubbornness that bordered on pathological. When the alternator died on the freeway at midnight, it was not Jolene who crawled under the hood. It was Cassidy. She pulled the sweatshirt hood over her dark hair, pushed the heavy door of the Taurus open against the wind, and stepped out into the biting November rain. The moment she pushed through the heavy side entrance of Blackstone Motors, the roar of a revving engine hit her chest like a physical blow. The vibration traveled through the concrete floor, up through the soles of her worn sneakers, and settled deep in her ribs. The air inside was thick and alive. High-octane fuel, burning rubber. The sharp metallic bite of freshly cut steel. Classic rock poured from a paint-spattered boombox perched on a towering red snap-on tool chest, the base rattling the wrenches hanging on the pegboard wall. Men the size of industrial refrigerators moved through the cavernous space with a practiced predatory grace. They were covered in faded ink that crawled up their necks and disappeared under grease-stained denim and cracked leather. Through an open doorway in the back of the shop, partially obscured by a curtain of heavy plastic strips, Cassidy caught a glimpse of leather vests bearing the insignia she had seen on the evening news. The Iron Reaper's death's head, a grinning skull wrapped in barbed wire flanked by crossed pistons, the mark of men who lived outside the law and dared the world to do something about it. Her heart hammered against her sternum like a fist pounding on a locked door. She almost turned around. Almost. "Shops closed to walk-ins!" A voice cut through the music like a blade through wet paper. Cassidy turned. Wiping his hands on a filthy red shop rag was a man who looked like he had been chiseled from the same granite as the Sierra Nevada. He was in his late 40s with a thick salt and pepper beard that obscured most of his jaw. Cold blue eyes set deep beneath a heavy brow and a network of pale scars crisscrossing his forearms like a road map of violence. A patch stitched onto his leather vest read a single word in blocky white letters. Flint. "I'm not a customer," Cassidy said. Her voice cracked on the second word, the fear leaking through like water through a cracked dam. But she forced her chin up. She had learned that from the streets. Never look down. Looking down means you have already lost. I'm looking for work. I heard you need a shop hand. Flint stopped wiping his hands. The rag went still. He stared at her with an expression that was not curiosity and not amusement. It was assessment. His gaze moved over her like a mechanic, inspecting a vehicle for hidden damage, cataloging every detail. The hollow cheeks, the dark circles under her eyes, the sweatshirt that was 2 sizes too large because it was easier to sleep in something that doubled as a blanket, the sneakers with the sole separating at the toe. Several other mechanics stopped what they were doing. The pneumatic whine of an impact wrench died. A welder flipped up his mask. The silence that settled over the front bay was heavy and absolute, broken only by the persistent drum of rain on the steel roof. "You heard wrong, little girl," Flint said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to come from somewhere deep in the earth. "This ain't a place for kids. Go back to school." "I'm 19," Cassidy said, taking another step into the light that spilled from the overhead fluorescence. "And I don't need a babysitter. I need a wrench and a paycheck. I can sweep your floors, organize your tools, and I know my way around a V-twin engine block better than most guys twice my age." A younger man across the room let out a sharp bark of laughter. He was lean and wiry, maybe 23, with dark hair buzzed close on the sides and a constellation of tattoos climbing his neck and disappearing behind his left ear. He wore the vest of a prospect with the bottom rocker blank where a full patch would someday sit. His name, Cassidy would learn later, was Tate. "She's got grit, Flint," Tate called out, grinning. "Or she's just stupid." Flint did not smile. He pointed a grease-blackened finger at a workbench against the far wall where a disassembled carburetor sat in pieces on a sheet of stainless steel. "That's off an '84 shovelhead. The kid who got fired yesterday couldn't get the float adjusted right. It's been flooding the bowl. You have 10 minutes to tell me what he did wrong. If you can't, you walk out that door and you never come down the street again." Cassidy did not hesitate. She crossed the oil-stained concrete with purpose, acutely aware of the weight of every pair of eyes in the room pressing against her back. She could feel their skepticism like a physical force, a wall of disbelief that a girl who looked like she had not eaten a proper meal in a week could possibly know the difference between a float pin and a cotter pin. She shut them out. She shut out the music and the rain and the hammering of her own terrified heart. She focused entirely on the metal. Her fingers, though trembling slightly from cold and adrenaline, moved with a precision that came from years of necessity. She picked up the float assembly, turning it slowly in the fluorescent light, examining the way the brass pin sat in its cradle. She found it in under 3 minutes. "He forced the pin," Cassidy said, holding up the tiny piece of bent brass between her thumb and forefinger so Flint could see it from across the bay. "See the bend?" He used pliers instead of pressing it by hand. That threw the alignment off so the needle isn't seating properly in the valve. Fuel is just pouring into the bowl with nothing to stop it. You need a new pin and the seat needs to be cleaned out. He left grit in the threading, probably from the same pliers. Tate whistled low from his corner. The welder slowly lowered his mask and went back to work, the blue arc of the torch flickering to life like a grudging nod of respect. Flint walked over. He took the bent pin from her hand, his calloused fingers dwarfing the tiny component. He held it up to the light, rolled it between his thumb and forefinger, then looked back at Cassidy. His expression had not changed. But something behind his eyes had shifted, a tectonic movement so subtle that only someone watching very carefully would have caught it. "What's your name, kid?" Cassidy. Cassidy Mercer." The shift became seismic. At the sound of her last name, the muscle in Flint's jaw tightened. His eyes narrowed by a fraction of a degree. It lasted less than a second. Then his face was granite again. "Minimum wage. Off the books. Cash at the end of every week. You sweep, you scrub, you fetch parts, and you keep your mouth shut about anything you see or hear inside this building. Anything. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" "Yes, sir." "Don't call me sir. It's Flint turned his back and then walked toward his office. "Starts at 6 in the morning. Don't be late, Mercer." That night, Cassidy lay on the back seat of the Ford Taurus parked behind the warehouse on Peralta Street, staring at the stained ceiling fabric above her. The springs dug into her hip. The cold crept through the blankets like something alive. But for the first time in 17 days, the gnawing in her stomach was not the loudest thing in her body. Something else was louder. It took her a long time to identify it. Hope. She hated it. Hope was the thing that had broken her mother over and over again. Hope was the new boyfriend. Hope was the job that was going to fix everything. Hope was the lottery ticket purchased with the last $5 that should have bought milk. But here it was uninvited and dangerous, sitting in her chest like a small warm coal she could not extinguish. She closed her eyes. 6 in the morning. She could not be late. The first 2 weeks at Blackstone Motors were a masterclass in endurance. Cassidy's hands became permanently stained the color of used motor oil. The chemical black seeped into the creases of her knuckles, settled under her fingernails, and no amount of the harsh orange pumice soap in the shop bathroom could fully remove it. Her back ached from hours of scrubbing the concrete floors with a wire brush. Her ears rang at night from the constant assault of air compressors, unbaffled exhausts, and the ear-splitting shriek of angle grinders eating through rusted steel. But for the first time in her 19 years on this earth, she had a purpose. A reason to wake up before dawn. A place that expected her to show up and would notice if she did not. The garage was a complex ecosystem with its own laws, its own hierarchy, and its own brutal form of justice. Cassidy learned her place at the bottom of the food chain quickly and without complaint. She was the one who crawled under the lifts to clean the drain pans. She was the one who made the coffee runs in the rain. She was the one who organized the thousands of bolts and washers in the parts caged by size and thread pitch until her eyes blurred. The warnings from the outside world came fast. When Cassidy walked 3 blocks to the corner bodega to buy her nightly dinner of instant ramen and a bruised apple, the older woman behind the register leaned across the counter with worried eyes. "You shouldn't be around those men, sweetheart. They're dangerous. The Iron Reapers don't follow the same rules the rest of us do. One wrong step and they'll make you disappear." Cassidy had just nodded, clutching her plastic bag. The woman meant well. The neighborhood meant well. The retired postman who sat on the bench outside the barbershop 3 doors down shook his head every morning when he saw her walk to the garage in the dark. The church lady who ran the soup kitchen on Fridays pressed pamphlets into her hand about youth shelters and second chances. They all meant well, every single one of them. But not one of them had offered her a job when she was starving. Not one of them had stopped the landlord from changing the locks. Society saw monsters and outlaws and criminals, and maybe they were right. But monsters had given her a paycheck when the rest of the world had given her nothing but silence and pamphlets. Inside Blackstone Motors, the dynamic was harsh but navigable. The men were crude, loud, and deeply intimidating. Their humor was brutal, and their patience for weakness was non-existent. But beneath the leather and the ink and the criminal records there was a code. A rigid, almost religious set of unwritten rules that governed every interaction. Tate, the young prospect, desperate to earn his full patch, rode Cassidy hard for the first week. He hid her tools. He left the filthiest, most disgusting jobs for her. He told her to drain the waste oil tank with a hand pump that he knew was broken, then sat back and watched as she got sprayed with black sludge from head to toe. But when Cassidy retaliated by packing his work boots with axle grease on a cold morning, Tate did not get angry. He stood there in the bay, 1 foot sunk into a boot full of thick black grease, stared at her for a long, dangerous moment, then threw his head back and laughed. It was a genuine, full-throated sound that echoed off the steel walls. He clapped her on the shoulder so hard she stumbled forward. "All right, Mercer. You're all right." From that moment the hazing stopped. Then there was Sledge. If Flint was the brain of Blackstone Motors, Sledge was the heart. He was a colossal man who stood 6 feet and 6 inches tall, with shoulders wide enough to block a doorway and a beard that fell to the middle of his chest like a curtain of dark copper wire. He was the master mechanic. He spoke to motorcycle engines with a tenderness and a patience he never extended to human beings. His hands, which were the size of dinner plates and scarred across every knuckle, could adjust a carburetor needle with the precision of a surgeon, or reshape a dented gas tank with a body hammer like a sculptor working clay. Cassidy learned bits and pieces about his past from the other men, always spoken in low voices and never in his presence. He had served 2 tours overseas before coming home to a country that did not know what to do with the man it had created. He carried the war inside him the way other men carried their wallets, always there, always heavy. Invisible to everyone who was not looking for it. The motorcycle club had given him what the Veterans Administration could not. A brotherhood, a mission, a reason to get up in the morning that did not involve staring at the ceiling and wondering if the sound he heard was a backfiring engine or something worse. Despite his terrifying appearance and the persistent rumors that he had once served time in San Quentin for putting a rival club member through a plate glass window, Sledge became Cassidy's silent guardian. It happened on a rainy Tuesday morning, the kind of gray, relentless Oakland morning that made the world feel like it had been wrapped in wet concrete. Cassidy was under a lift struggling with a rusted bolt on a suspension swing arm. She had not eaten since the previous afternoon. She had been relying on tap water from the shop bathroom to fill the hollow ache in her stomach, telling herself it was just another day, just another stretch of hunger she had survived before. A massive shadow fell over her. She looked up. Sledge stood there, his leather vest straining across his enormous frame. In one grease-covered hand, he held a steaming foil-wrapped breakfast burrito from the food truck that parked on the corner every morning. "Eat." His voice was like a rock slide. Not a request. Not an offer. A command. Cassidy took the burrito. The heat of it seeped through the foil and into her freezing fingers, and the warmth traveled up her arms and settled somewhere behind her ribs in a place she had forgotten existed. "Thank you, Sledge." "Don't thank me." He was already turning back to his welding station. "You're getting too skinny, making the shop look bad." It was a small gesture. A burrito, a few dollars from a giant man who probably spent more on motorcycle chrome in a week than Cassidy had seen in a year. But to a girl who had spent her entire life scavenging for scraps of affection from a mother who could barely keep herself alive, it felt monumental. It felt like proof that the world contained something other than abandonment. The bikers did not ask about her past. They did not pry into where she came from or why a 19-year-old girl was willing to work for minimum wage in a garage tied to one of the most notorious motorcycle clubs in America. They demanded hard work, they demanded loyalty, they demanded silence. And in return they provided something Cassidy had never had. A place that did not change the locks when she was not looking. But the reality of her living situation was becoming harder to hide. As November deepened and the Oakland nights turned bitter, Cassidy would leave the garage after her shift walk 3 blocks east to an abandoned warehouse lot and climb into the back seat of her Taurus. She slept under a pile of thin blankets from the Goodwill on San Pablo Avenue, waking every few hours when the cold penetrated deep enough to jolt her out of unconsciousness. She would start the engine and run the heater for 10 minutes, watching the gas gauge creep toward empty, then shut it off and curl back into the darkness. She developed a routine for making the homelessness invisible. She showered at the gym down the block using a free trial membership that had expired 2 weeks ago, but whose front desk attendant had stopped checking. She brushed her teeth in the gas station bathroom on International Boulevard. She kept her work clothes in a plastic bin in the trunk so they would not absorb the smell of the car, that permanent cocktail of vanilla air freshener and something sadder. The hardest part was the mornings. She would wake before 5, shivering so hard her jaw ached from clenching, and she would sit in the driver's seat and watch the fog roll in off the bay. In those moments before the sun burned through and the city woke up, Oakland looked almost peaceful, almost forgiving. And Cassidy would allow herself exactly 60 seconds to feel sorry for herself before she started the engine, drove to the gas station, and began the elaborate performance of being a girl with a home. One Thursday evening, long after the front bays had been locked and the men had retreated to the back room for what they called church, the private meeting of patch members that no outsider was permitted to witness, Cassidy stayed behind. She was organizing the parts cage counting inventory against the clipboard Flint had left on the counter. She thought she was alone. The heavy thud of boots behind her said otherwise. She turned. Flint stood in the hallway that connected the shop to the clubhouse, a clipboard of his own tucked under one arm, his blue eyes narrowed in the dim light. "You're still here, Mercer." "Just finishing the inventory. Wanted to make sure the count matched before morning." Flint studied her. The way she stood slightly hunched as if bracing against a wind that never stopped blowing. The way her fingers gripped the clipboard a little too tight. "I saw you walking toward the rail yards last night," Flint said. His voice was quiet, dangerously quiet. "Down by the old warehouse on Peralta Street." Cassidy's heart stopped. "I like to take walks. At midnight, in that neighborhood." It was not a question, it was an indictment. "I'm not stupid, kid, and neither are my guys. Tate ran the plates on that beat-up Ford parked behind the chain link down there. It's registered to a Jolene Mercer." The name hit like a slap. Cassidy stared at the concrete floor, fighting the sudden violent sting of tears that threatened to destroy everything she had built over the past 2 weeks. She had worked so hard to prove she was tough, that she belonged, that she was not a stray dog looking for scraps. Admitting that she was sleeping in a dead car behind a warehouse felt like a surrender she could not afford. Flint took a step closer. He placed a heavy hand on her shoulder. The grip was firm, anchoring, not threatening. It was the grip of a man who had held a lot of broken things together over the years. "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because you said this wasn't a place for kids." Cassidy looked up at him, her eyes burning. "I didn't want you to think I was a charity case. I can pull my own weight. I've been pulling it my whole life." Flint sighed. It was a sound that seemed to rise from a very deep place, carrying with it the weight of years and decisions and losses that Cassidy could not begin to fathom. He looked at her with an expression she could not decipher. Sorrow, recognition, something older and heavier than both. "Nobody in this shop thinks you're a charity case, Cassidy." His voice was rough, but the edges had softened. "But we don't let our own freeze on the street." He reached into the pocket of his vest and pulled out a heavy brass key. He set it on the metal counter between them with a sharp clink that echoed in the empty garage like a bell. "There's a studio apartment above the back bays," Flint said, already turning to walk away. "It's got heat, a lock on the door, and a shower. It's yours. Rent comes out of your paycheck. Move in tonight. I don't want to hear about you sleeping in that coffin on wheels again." Before Cassidy could even formulate a response, he was halfway down the hall. "Flint!" Cassidy's voice caught. She wanted to say thank you. She wanted to say something that matched the magnitude of what he was offering. A locked door, heat, safety, the most basic human dignities that most people took for granted, and that she had been denied so completely that receiving them now felt like being handed the keys to a palace. He stopped in the doorway, but did not turn around. "Don't make me regret it, Mercer." Then he was gone. The heavy steel door to the clubhouse swung shut behind him with a sound like the closing of one chapter and the uncertain opening of another. For the next 3 months, the room above the garage became Cassidy's fortress. It was small. A single bed with a metal frame. A hot plate on a plywood counter. A bathroom with a shower that took 4 minutes to produce hot water. The floor vibrated gently with the hum of the compressors below. The walls smelled like old paint and engine exhaust. It was the most beautiful place she had ever lived. She painted the walls on a Sunday afternoon using leftover primer from the shop. She hung a cheap mechanic's calendar from the auto parts store, the only decoration. She bought a second-hand radio from the thrift store and kept it tuned to the classic rock station that played through the garage below, so that even when she was alone, the music connected her to the world downstairs. She was building a life out of spare parts and salvage the same way she had always built everything. She was no longer just a shop hand. She was part of the organism. Tate taught her how to ride a lightweight Sportster 883 in the alley behind the garage, laughing every time she stalled the clutch and lurching forward like a rodeo rider on a mechanical bull. Sledge showed her how to rebuild a Harley transmission from a box of loose gears and then a service manual he had memorized decades ago. And Flint continued to watch over her with a silent, brooding intensity that she could not explain but had stopped questioning. She had almost forgotten about the world outside the corrugated steel walls. Almost forgotten the taste of copper and cold coffee. Almost forgotten that she had once been a girl with no name and no address and no one in the world who would notice if she simply ceased to exist, until the Friday before Thanksgiving. The garage was buzzing with activity. A local charity toy run was happening the following day, and dozens of motorcycles were being prepped. Chrome was being polished. Tires were being checked. The air smelled like chain lube in anticipation. Cassidy was at the front counter tallying a parts invoice on a grease-spotted calculator when the glass front door chimed. She did not look up. "Be right with you." Well, ain't this a cozy little setup? The voice hit her like a crowbar to the sternum. The pen slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the concrete floor. She looked up and the blood drained from her face as if someone had pulled a plug at the base of her skull. Standing in the doorway, backlit by the gray November sky, was Donnie Pruitt, her mother's ex-boyfriend, the man who used to drink away their grocery money and then use his fists on Cassidy when Jolene was not around to see it. He was thinner than she remembered. His cheeks were hollow, his skin the color of old newspaper. There was a manic twitching energy in his sunken eyes that spoke of substances far harder than the cheap beer he used to favor. Donnie. The name came out as a whisper. A name she had buried so deep she thought it would never reach the surface again, brought with it a flood of sense memories she had spent years trying to erase. The smell of cheap whiskey, the sound of a belt being unbuckled, the specific quality of silence that fills a room when a drunk man is deciding whether to use his words or his hands. "Took me a hell of a time tracking you down, brat." Donnie stepped further into the shop. He looked around at the expensive motorcycles, the rough-looking men moving in the bays, the tools worth more than everything he had ever owned combined. He seemed completely oblivious to the danger radiating from every corner of the room, the arrogance of a desperate man who had nothing left to lose. "Your mother owes me $5,000. She skipped town, which means you're holding her bag. I want my money. I don't have your money." Cassidy forced her voice to stay level, but it trembled at the edges like a sheet of metal in the wind. "She left me too. I haven't seen her in months. You need to leave, right now. Don't you lie to me!" Donnie's voice cracked into a shout. He lunged forward and slammed both palms flat on the counter. The impact sent the calculator skidding off the edge. "I know she left you a stash. Give it up or I swear to God I'll drag you out of here by your hair just like the old days." He reached across the counter, his fingers closing around the collar of Cassidy's shop shirt. She cried out, trying to pull away, but his grip was fueled by panic and chemical rage and something darker than both. Then the world stopped. The deafening noise of the garage died. All of it. At once. The air compressors hissed into silence. The impact wrenches went mute. The music was killed mid-chord. The sudden absence of sound was more terrifying than any noise could have been. The only thing that remained was the heavy, rhythmic thud of steel-toed boots against the concrete floor, multiple sets, coming from every direction. Donnie froze. The hand on Cassidy's collar went rigid. He turned his head slowly the way a rabbit turns when it hears the brush move behind it. 5 men had materialized from the work bays, forming a loose semicircle that closed off every exit. Sledge stood at the center, his massive frame completely blocking the path to the rear of the shop. In his right hand he held a 3-foot breaker bar, the heavy chrome catching the fluorescent light. Tate was to his left, a thick ratchet wrench sliding casually from one hand to the other, his face completely empty of the boyish humor Cassidy had come to know. Behind them, 2 more patch members, Briggs and Nolan, stood with their arms across their eyes as flat and dead as river stones. They did not look like mechanics anymore. They looked like what they were. The Iron Reapers, the men that mothers warned their children about. The men that made hardened criminals cross the street. You have about 3 seconds to take your hands off the girl. Flint's voice came from the doorway of his office. He walked slowly toward the counter, his thumbs hooked casually in the pockets of his leather vest, his boots clicking a measured rhythm on the concrete. There was no urgency in his movement. The urgency belonged entirely to the man on the other side of the counter. Donnie released Cassidy's collar and stumbled backward. His bravado collapsed like a tent in a hurricane, replaced by the stark animal terror of a man who had just realized he had walked into a cage. Hey man, listen. This is a family thing. It's got nothing to do with you people. You came into my house. Flint stopped inches from Donnie. The height difference was marginal. But Flint's presence consumed the air around him, swallowing the smaller man whole. You put your hands on my employee. In my shop, in front of my crew. That makes it my business. She owes me. Donnie's voice was a squeak now. He backed up until his hip collided with a rolling tool cart, sending a cascade of sockets clattering to the floor. I don't care if the Almighty himself owes you money. Flint's voice dropped to a whisper. A whisper was worse than a shout. A whisper meant the words were meant only for the man standing in front of him and that the consequences would be equally personal. You look at her again. You breathe in her direction. You so much as drive down this street, and they'll be pulling pieces of you out of the San Francisco Bay for the next 6 months. Do you understand me? Donnie looked at Sledge. Sledge tapped the breaker bar against his open palm. The sound was soft, rhythmic, patient. Donnie nodded, frantically, repeatedly. Get out! Donnie Pruitt scrambled for the door, tripping over his own feet, his hands shaking so violently that he could barely grip the handle. The door slammed behind him, and through the glass, Cassidy watched him sprint across the wet parking lot and disappear around the corner as if the devil himself were at his heels. The moment the door closed, the tension in the room cracked like a dam. Cassidy's knees gave way. She sank to the floor behind the counter, buried her face in her hands, and a violent sigh tore from her chest. She could not stop it. The terror and the relief and the memory of Donnie's hands in the old days and the bruises she had hidden under long sleeves for years all came flooding out at once. She expected them to tell her to toughen up, to mock her, to remind her that this was not a place for tears. Instead, Sledge walked behind the counter. The giant man knelt beside her, his knees cracking like gunshots on the concrete, and placed one enormous hand gently on the top of her head. The warmth of his palm radiated through her skull. He's gone, kid. He ain't coming back. Tate walked to the counter, his jaw tight, his eyes hard. Flint, you want me to follow him? Make sure the message stuck. No. Flint's voice was soft now. The predator had retreated. He's a coward. Cowards don't come back. Flint looked down at Cassidy. Come into my office, Mercer. Now. Cassidy wiped her face with her sleeve, the shame of her tears burning hotter than the tears themselves, and followed Flint into his cluttered back office. He closed the door behind them, sealing off the sounds of the garage, returning to its normal rhythm. He pointed to a worn leather chair. She sat. Flint paced. He ran a hand over his bearded jaw. Stop paced again, then planted himself against the edge of his desk and looked at her with an intensity that pinned her to the chair. I knew who you were the day you walked in. The words landed like a grenade. Cassidy stared at him. What? Your mother, Jolene! Flint crossed his arms. 20 years ago, her name was Jolene Bayless. She didn't just hang around this neighborhood. She was an old lady. She rode with the Iron Reapers. The room tilted. Cassidy gripped the arms of the chair as if the floor had opened beneath her. My mother was with the Iron Reapers. She was with a brother of ours, Flint said. His voice was careful now, measured, like a man defusing a bomb. A guy named Wraith Mercer. He was a hard man. Good in a fight, bad at being a father. When things got too heavy with the law and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives started circling, Wraith got sent up to federal lockup on a 20-year bid. Jolene panicked. She took you, changed her name, and disappeared. We spent years trying to find you, to make sure you were safe. Wraith Mercer. Cassidy's voice was barely audible. The name felt foreign in her mouth, and yet somehow familiar, like a word in a language she had known as an infant and forgotten. That was my father. Flint nodded. He died in federal prison 3 years ago. Heart gave out. The prison doctor said it was sudden. I like to think it was. I like to think the world at least gave him that. He paused. When you walked in here, gave me your last name, and looked at me with your mother's eyes, I knew exactly who you were. I just needed time to be sure you weren't sent by someone to cause trouble. Why didn't you tell me? Cassidy whispered. The question contained multitudes. Why did no one ever tell her anything? Why was her life a series of truths withheld and revelations detonated like landmines under her feet? Because you were scared and starving and you needed to earn your place in this shop on your own merit, not because of a dead man's name. Flint paused. The granite facade cracked for just a moment, and beneath it Cassidy glimpsed something raw. I had a daughter, Flint said quietly. Madeline. She was killed in a motorcycle accident 8 years ago. She was 21. Coming home from college on the 580, a truck driver fell asleep and crossed the median. They told me she died before the ambulance arrived. I don't know if that's true or if they just said it so I wouldn't burn the hospital down looking for someone to blame. He stopped. His jaw worked. The silence in the office was total. I built this garage into what it is because I didn't know what else to do with the rage. I poured it into steel and chrome in these walls. I took care of the club because the club was the only thing that didn't remind me of her. Flint's eyes were dry, but the pain behind them was visible, a vast reservoir held back by a dam made of sheer will. When you walked through that door, Flint continued, his voice rough. Soaking wet, half-starved, looking at me with those stubborn, terrified eyes, I saw her. I saw every chance I never got to protect her. I'm not telling you this so you'll feel sorry for me. I'm telling you so you understand that what happens in this shop is not charity. It's not a transaction. You aren't just a stray we took in Cassidy. He reached out and tapped his scarred knuckles gently against her sternum right over her heart. Your family, your club legacy, and nobody touches our family. The days that followed were an earthquake in slow motion. Cassidy had spent 19 years believing she was a tragic accident, a burden her mother had been forced to carry until the weight became too much, and she simply set it down and walked away. Learning that she was the daughter of Wraith Mercer, a fully patched Iron Reaper who had sacrificed his freedom to protect the very men who now surrounded her, rewired the entire circuitry of her identity. The dynamic inside Blackstone Motors shifted. Sledge no longer just handed her burritos. After closing, he would clear a workbench and spend an hour teaching her the intricate mechanics of old knucklehead engines, passing down knowledge the way a grandfather passes down fishing lures and pocket knives. Tate, who had finally earned his full patch and a new Blackstone rocker for his leather vest, stopped treating her like a little sister to be tested, and started treating her like a member of the family who needed to be kept safe. When the Iron Reapers held their monthly gathering, what they called Church Cassidy was no longer sent upstairs. She was not permitted inside the meeting room with the patch members, the heavy oak door remained shut, and the conversation behind it was conducted in voices too low to penetrate the walls. But she was invited to the massive pig roast that followed in the fenced back lot. This was the social fabric of the club. The hours after the business was done, when the leather and the protocol relaxed and the men became something closer to human. Motorcycles from neighboring charters filled the gravel yard, their engines ticking as they cooled in the night air. Women appeared, old ladies and girlfriends and wives who moved through the gathering with a casual authority that Cassidy found fascinating. They were not decorations, they were the infrastructure. They kept the food hot and the beer cold and the conversations from turning into fights, and they did it with a grace born from years of practice. The smell of smoking meat and spilled beer mixed with the permanent Oakland scent of diesel and wet pavement. Cassidy stood near the industrial smoker, a cold bottle in her hand, watching the sea of leather and denim move around her like a current she was only beginning to learn how to swim in. Overwhelming, isn't it? She turned. Standing beside her was a man she had not seen before. He was older than Flint, his face a topographical map of deep wrinkles and old scars that caught the firelight. He wore a president's patch over his left breast and a nomad rocker on his back. His eyes were a pale, unsettling gray, the color of winter sage just before a storm. "I'm Stokes," he said, extending a hand that looked like it had been broken and reset multiple times. "Cassidy." She shook it firmly. She had learned that a weak handshake in this world was an invitation to be dismissed. Stokes smiled. It was slow in knowing the smile of a man who had seen the world turn enough times to recognize its patterns. "I know who you are. You've got Wraith's jawline, stubborn as granite. Your daddy and I rode together before things went sideways for him." Cassidy gripped her bottle tighter. "Flint told me he died in federal prison, but nobody will tell me what he actually did." Stokes looked out over the crowd, his gray eyes reflecting the fire. The smile faded. Wraith was a good brother. One of the best I ever rode with. But he got greedy. He started running guns off the books, without the club's blessing. Side deals, personal profit. When the ATF caught wind, they put the squeeze on him. They offered him a deal, turn informant, give them the whole Northern California operation on a silver platter, and they'd let him walk. Stokes paused, letting the fire crackle in the silence. Wraith refused. He took a 20-year federal sentence to keep his mouth shut and keep this club alive. Every man at this barbecue owes his freedom to your father's silence. But before they locked him up, Wraith told me something. He said he'd made insurance. A record of everything the club had done, every payoff, every deal, every name. He said he gave it to Jolene, told her to use it to buy safety for you and her if the club ever forgot its debt. Stokes took a long pull from his beer and stared into the fire as if he could see the past in the flames. I was there the night they took him. Federal marshals. 6 of them. They came to this very garage at 4 in the morning. Wraith didn't run. He walked out the front door in his leather cut, handed me his keys, and told me to make sure his daughter knew he loved her. Those were his last words as a free man. I never got to deliver them, because Jolene was already gone. Cassidy stared into the fire. The weight of the truth settled in her chest like molten lead hardening as it cooled into something permanent. Did the club forget? Stokes shook his head. No, but Jolene didn't trust us. She ran with that insurance policy and never looked back. Can't say I blame her entirely. This world chews people up, Cassidy. Your mother did what she thought she had to do to keep you alive. The fire popped. Sparks spiraled upward into the Oakland sky like tiny desperate prayers. And now? Cassidy asked. Stokes looked at her with those winter storm eyes. Now you're here, and that changes everything. He walked away into the crowd, leaving Cassidy alone with the fire and the unbearable understanding that her entire life had been a flight from a past she never knew existed, that her mother's abandonment was not cruelty. It was a strategy. And the strategy had led her, whether by accident or design, to the exact place Jolene had spent 19 years running from. Cassidy thought about the letter she had never received, the phone call that never came. She thought about all the nights she had lain awake in whatever apartment they were renting that month, listening to Jolene argue with whatever man she had brought home and wondering if there was some fundamental defect in her own DNA that made people leave. Now she understood. Jolene had not been running from Cassidy. She had been running from the Iron Reapers, from the ghost of the man she had loved, from the insurance policy hidden somewhere in the ruins of their life together. Every move, every midnight departure, every new city and new school and new boyfriend who was going to change everything. It had all been part of a desperate improvised escape plan that had finally collapsed under its own weight. And when it collapsed, when the running could no longer outpace the past, Jolene had done the only thing she knew how to do. She had cut the rope and let Cassidy fall, hoping that the fall would take her somewhere safer than where Jolene was headed. Standing there in the back lot of Blackstone Motors, surrounded by the rumble of conversation and the crack of the fire and the gleam of chrome in the darkness, Cassidy felt something she had never felt before. Not hope. Something harder than hope. Clarity. She was not an accident. She was not a burden. She was the daughter of a man who had given 20 years of his life to protect these men, and whether the universe had a sense of humor or a sense of justice, it had delivered her to the one place where that sacrifice still meant something. Blackstone Motors, the Iron Reapers, home. And somewhere hidden in the wreckage of her old life, the insurance policy her father had created to protect her was still waiting to be found. A nuclear weapon disguised as a notebook. A dead man's final gift to a daughter he never got to hold. Cassidy finished her beer, set the empty bottle on the edge of the smoker, and walked back into the garage. The fluorescent lights hummed above her. The motorcycles gleamed in their rows. The Death's head patches watched from every wall. She climbed the metal staircase to her apartment, each step ringing beneath her boots. Inside, she sat on the edge of her bed and stared at her hands. They were the hands of a mechanic now. Stained, calloused, strong. The hands of a girl who had learned to take things apart and put them back together. She thought about Flint and the way he had tapped his knuckles against her heart. She thought about Sledge and the burritos and the way he taught her about knucklehead engines like he was passing down sacred texts. She thought about Tate and the grease in his boots and the laugh that had changed everything. She had spent 19 years as a ghost. Now she had a name. She had a legacy. And she had no idea that the name and the legacy were about to put a target on her back that neither the law nor the outlaws could remove. The Oakland rain returned on a Tuesday, falling in heavy silver sheets that turned the gutters into rivers and hammered the corrugated steel roof of Blackstone Motors like 10,000 impatient fingers. It was the kind of rain that erased the line between the sky and the earth, turning everything into a single gray canvas of water and concrete, and the persistent low-grade misery that Oakland wore like a second skin in November. Cassidy was alone in the front bay, lying on a creeper beneath the customer's Road King changing brake pads. The fluorescent lights above cast a flat white glow across the shop, and the only sounds were the drip of water from the ceiling vents and the metallic scrape of her socket wrench against the caliper bolt. She had settled into the rhythm of the garage the way a heart settles into a steady beat. Wake at 5. Coffee from the machine in the break room that produced a liquid more closely related to motor oil than any coffee bean. Work until the light faded. Clean, organize. Fall asleep to the vibration of the building and the distant sound of the freeway. It was not glamorous, it was not easy, but it was hers. For the first time in her life, every day had a shape and a purpose and an ending that she controlled. The sound of a car pulling up to the open bay doors cut through the rain, not the rumble of a motorcycle, not the familiar diesel cough of a delivery truck. This was the smooth, predatory purr of a government sedan. Cassidy rolled out from under the bike and sat up on the creeper, instinctively reaching for the heavy lug wrench on the floor beside her. 2 men stepped out of a dark sedan. They wore cheap suits that fit poorly across the shoulders, the fabric already darkening with rain. They did not have the rough, chaotic energy of the men Cassidy had grown accustomed to. There was no ink crawling up their necks, no leather, no grease. They reeked of institutional authority, the kind that came with badges and warrants, and the absolute conviction that the law was a weapon, and they were the ones holding it. "Shop's closed," Cassidy called out, climbing to her feet. "We aren't here for an oil change." The taller one flashed a gold badge from inside his jacket. He was in his early 50s with thinning hair combed straight back from a forehead lined with stress fractures. His eyes were the pale, washed-out blue of a man who had spent decades looking at people and seeing only the worst in them. "Agent Caldwell, a TF. You're Cassidy Mercer, right? Jolene Bayless's kid." The blood in Cassidy's veins turned to ice water. She had not heard her mother's maiden name spoken aloud in years. It was a name from a different life, a name that belonged to a woman who had existed before the running started. Hearing it in the mouth of a federal agent spoken with the casual confidence of a man reading from a dossier he had memorized made the garage feel suddenly smaller, as if the walls had moved inward by a foot. "I don't know who you're talking about." Caldwell chuckled. It was not a friendly sound. It was the sound a cat makes when it has cornered something small and is deciding whether to play with it first. He leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms, with the casual arrogance of a man accustomed to making people uncomfortable in their own spaces. "Sure you don't. Listen, kid. We know Wraith Mercer left a safety deposit box and a ledger before he got locked up. Insurance in case the club ever forgot about his family. Your mother was supposed to hand it over to us 10 years ago in exchange for full immunity and witness protection. Instead she ran. Now she's missing and you're shacked up with the very gang that put your father in a pine box." Cassidy gripped the lug wrench tighter. "The club didn't kill my father." "No, the federal prison system did, after the club let him take a 20-year fall." Caldwell's voice sharpened. He took a step closer. "They're using you, Cassidy. They don't give a damn about you. They're keeping you close because they think your mother sent you here with the ledger. They're watching your every move, cataloging everything you do, and the second they find that book or the second they decide you don't have it, they'll make sure you're not around to talk about it. Get off the property." The voice came from the shadows of the hallway like the first crack of thunder before a storm. Flint stepped into the light, his boots striking the concrete with the measured cadence of a man who has learned that speed is not the same as power. Behind him, Sledge materialized like a mountain emerging from fog, and 2 more patched members, Briggs and Nolan, flanked the corridor. The agents were not outnumbered. They were outclassed. The difference between a man with a badge and a man with a leather cut bearing the death's head was the difference between a rule book and a religion. One could be rewritten. The other was carved in bone. Caldwell held up his hands, palms out. "Just having a friendly conversation, Flint, catching up with the youth." "You don't talk to her." Flint's voice was a controlled detonation. He positioned himself directly between Cassidy and the agents as body a wall. "You want to talk, you go through our lawyers. Now get off my lot before I have Sledge toss your sedan into the compactor with you still in it." Caldwell's smile didn't waver, but his eyes did. He reached into his breast pocket, pulled out a white business card and tossed it. It fluttered through the air and then landed on the oil-stained concrete at Cassidy's feet. "Think about what I said, kid. When you find it, and you will find it, call me before they figure out you're more useful as a loose end they can cut. I can still get you out of this. Witness protection. New name, new life, a life where you don't have to look over your shoulder every time you hear a motorcycle." The agents left. The tires of their sedan squealed on the wet pavement, the sound sharp and petulant like the last word in an argument they knew they were losing. Cassidy stared at the business card on the floor. She did not pick it up. "Don't listen to a word that Fed says," Flint said. His voice was softer now, but when Cassidy looked at him, she saw something she had never seen in his eyes before. Doubt. Not doubt about her, doubt about whether the walls he had built were thick enough to protect her from what was coming. The doubt in Flint's eyes haunted Cassidy for weeks. She turned Caldwell's words over and over in her mind like a mechanic turning a bolt, checking for stripped threads. "They think your mother sent you here with the ledger." The sentence was a virus. It infected every moment of warmth she had experienced in the garage, reframing kindness as strategy and protection as containment. When Sledge brought her a burrito, was it because he cared or because a well-fed prisoner was less likely to escape? When Flint asked how she was doing, was it concern or surveillance? She hated herself for thinking it, but she could not stop. Could Donnie have been right? Was the money he was looking for not money at all, but something far more dangerous? Was the stash he had demanded actually the insurance policy Agent Caldwell wanted? Late one night, long after the garage had gone dark and the last motorcycle had rumbled into the Oakland streets, Cassidy lay awake in her apartment above the bays. The rain had stopped. The silence was enormous. She stared at the ceiling, watching the shadow of the neon sign pulse against the plaster. She had to know. She pulled on her heavy jacket, laced her boots, and crept down the metal staircase. Every step was deliberate, placed on the outside edge of each tread where the bolts held tightest and the metal did not sing. She slipped through the side door and walked 3 blocks in the freezing cold to the abandoned lot on Peralta Street, where her dead Ford Taurus still sat. The tires were flat now. The windshield was covered in a thick layer of grime and dead leaves. It looked like a coffin on wheels. The last piece of her mother she had left. If Jolene had hidden something, if she had truly been running from both the federal government and the club for 19 years, the secret had to be in the car. It was the only constant in their lives. Every apartment changed. Every boyfriend was temporary. Every city was a waypoint. But the Taurus had been there through all of it, a rolling archive of every mile they had put between themselves and the truth. Cassidy forced the frozen door lock open with the screwdriver she always carried in her jacket and climbed inside. The smell hit her instantly. Vanilla air freshener and despair. The phantom scent of her mother's perfume, cheap and floral, lingering in the upholstery like a ghost that had not yet learned it was dead. She tore the car apart. Methodically at first, then with increasing desperation. She ripped the upholstery off the rear seats, pulling the foam in chunks. She pried up the floorboards with the flat end of the screwdriver, her knuckles scraping against rusted metal. She dismantled the glove box, scattering expired registration papers and fast food receipts and a cracked pair of sunglasses across the passenger seat. She checked the trunk lining the spare tire well, the gaps between the door panels. She ran her fingers along every seam and every joint, searching for the slight irregularity that would betray a hidden compartment. Nothing. Every cavity was empty. Every panel was exactly what it appeared to be. The car was just a car. A 19-year-old Ford Taurus with 200,000 miles of running on it and nothing to show for any of them. Hours passed. Her hands were bleeding. Her knuckles were bruised and swollen. But she found nothing. Defeated Cassidy slumped forward against the steering wheel, her forehead pressing into the cracked vinyl. Tears of frustration burned hot on her cheeks. She was chasing ghosts. Caldwell was lying. The ledger was a fairy tale invented by desperate men, and she had fallen for it because she wanted so badly to believe that her mother's disappearance had meaning, that there was a reason beyond simple cowardice. She reached under the steering column to retrieve her flashlight, and her fingers brushed against the plastic casing of the fuse box. She paused. A memory surfaced. Not a dramatic memory, not a life-changing revelation, just a small, ordinary moment from when she was 16 years old. The car's electrical system had shorted out on the freeway. The headlights died. The radio went silent. Jolene had pulled over to the shoulder and absolutely lost her composure. Screaming, crying. Not the reaction of a woman whose headlights had failed. The reaction of a woman whose world was threatening to crack open. Jolene had insisted on paying a shady mechanic triple the normal price to fix the fuse box. She had stood over the man the entire time, watching his hands like a hawk, refusing to let Cassidy anywhere near the repair. "Don't touch it. Don't ever touch the fuse box. I'll handle it." At 16, Cassidy had assumed her mother was being irrational. Jolene was always irrational. But sitting in the dead car at 2 in the morning, her hands bleeding and her heart hammering the memory, rearranged itself into something entirely different. Cassidy grabbed the flathead screwdriver and wedged it into the seam of the fuse box casing. The plastic was brittle from years of temperature extremes. With a loud splintering crack, the panel popped free and clattered into her lap. Behind the standard rows of colorful fuses taped securely to the inner wall of the dashboard cavity, With electrical tape that had yellowed with age, was a thick, waterproof black pouch. Cassidy's hands trembled as she peeled the tape away and pulled the pouch free. The weight of it was significant. Not heavy. Significant. The weight of something that mattered. She unzipped it. Inside was a worn, leather-bound notebook, its cover cracked and darkened with age. Beside it, wrapped in a scrap of cloth, was a cluster of tarnished safety deposit box keys on a small steel ring. Cassidy opened the notebook. The pages were filled with cramped handwriting that she had never seen before, but that felt in some inexplicable way familiar. The letters were tight and angular, the handwriting of a man who had learned to write in small spaces. It was not just a ledger of gun-running routes and delivery schedules. It was a comprehensive record of an entire criminal ecosystem. Names, dates, dollar amounts, payoff schedules for corrupt police officers. Monthly envelopes delivered to a judge in the Alameda County Superior Court. Payments to a city councilman who had voted to block a zoning investigation of the garage. Payments to a customs official at the port of Oakland who looked the other way when certain cargo containers passed through his checkpoint. It was a nuclear weapon. If the federal government got their hands on it, they could dismantle the entire Northern California operation of the Iron Reapers. Every charter. Every patched member, every old lady, and every prospect and every business that had ever accepted a dollar that had been laundered through the club's legitimate fronts. The organization would not just be damaged, it would be erased. But as Cassidy flipped to the back of the notebook past the columns of numbers and the coded shorthand, she found a loose piece of folded notebook paper. It was not in the same tight, angular handwriting. This writing was erratic, slanted, and familiar. It was her mother's hand. Cassidy unfolded the letter. Cassidy, if you are reading this, I am either dead or I have completely run out of road. Your father told me to use this book to buy our safety from the feds. He said it was our ticket out, but the club would hunt us to the ends of the earth if I gave it to them. And I couldn't give it to Flint because I knew he'd kill me for keeping it hidden for so long. So I ran. I ran to draw the target away from you. Don't trust the law. They wanted this book 10 years ago, and I didn't give it to them because I knew they'd burn us the same as the club would. Don't trust the patch. They'll protect you as long as you're useful, and not a second longer. Trust yourself. Run. Cassidy stared at the letter. The betrayal sliced through her like a razor drawn across wet glass. Clean and total. Her mother had not abandoned her out of a lack of love. She had abandoned her to draw the hunters away. Jolene had taken the heat, absorbed the attention of both the federal agents and the club, and left Cassidy behind with the one piece of leverage that could either save her life or end it. Every moment of her childhood rearranged itself in an instant. The midnight moves, the new cities, the way Jolene would go pale and silent whenever a motorcycle rumbled past their apartment window, the way she checked the rearview mirror every 30 seconds on the freeway, the way she never ever let Cassidy post photographs of herself on the internet. It was not paranoia. It was not the erratic behavior of an unstable woman. It was the operational security of a fugitive who had spent 19 years running from an organization that did not forget and did not forgive. And now the fugitive was gone. And the thing she had been running from was sitting in Cassidy's bleeding hands in the front seat of a dead car on a dead street in a city that did not know her name. The car was silent. The night was silent. And in that silence, Cassidy Mercer held her father's legacy in her bleeding hands and understood for the first time that the family she had found at Blackstone Motors might be the very thing that destroyed her. Then headlights swept across the abandoned lot, painting the interior of the Taurus in harsh white light. Cassidy dropped to the floorboards, pressing the notebook against her chest, her heart slamming so hard she could feel it in her teeth. 2 heavy car doors slammed, boots crunched on gravel. The footsteps were deliberate searching, moving between the abandoned vehicles in the lot with the practiced efficiency of men who knew what they were looking for. I know she comes down here. The voice was familiar. It belonged to Harlan, one of the patched members of the inner circle. A man in his late 40s with a shaved head and a voice like grinding gears. Cassidy had served him coffee dozens of times. He had never said more than 2 words to her. Flint said to keep an eye on her, another voice replied. Tate. The sound of his name in this context spoken in hushed conspiracy instead of the easy banter of the shop floor made Cassidy's stomach drop. The feds are circling. If she's got Wraith's book, we need to handle this in-house before Caldwell gets a warrant. You think Flint would actually hurt the kid? Tate asked. There was something in his voice that had not been there before. Hesitation. The crack in the loyalty of a young man who had seen something that did not match the story he had been told. Flint protects the club first, Tate. You know the rules. Legacy or not, nobody's bigger than the patch. The footsteps moved past the Taurus. Cassidy pressed her hand over her mouth to muffle the sound of her own breathing. She lay on the filthy floorboards, the springs of the seat digging into her back. The notebook pressed so hard against her chest that the leather binding left an imprint on her skin through her shirt. The footsteps faded. An engine started. Headlights swung away. Silence returned. Cassidy did not move for a long time. She lay there in the dark in the car that had been her mother's escape vehicle and her own coffin, and she let the truth wash over her like the Oakland rain. The family she thought she had found was a mirage. They were not protecting her because she was Wraith's daughter. They were keeping her in a cage until they found the key to their own survival. Flint's kindness, Sledge's burritos, Tate's laughter. All of it was containment. All of it was management. She was an asset, not a daughter. And according to Harlan, the moment the asset became a liability, the asset would be eliminated. Her mother's letter burned against her chest. Trust yourself. Run. Cassidy Mercer had been running her entire life. But for the first time, she was running with something in her hands that the whole world wanted. She shoved the notebook and the safety deposit keys into the inner pocket of her jacket and zipped it tight. She could not stay in the car. Harlan knew she came here. She could not stay in Oakland. She needed money and transportation, and she needed both within the hour. Her mother's letter played on a loop in her skull. Trust yourself. Run. It was the last instruction Jolene had ever given her. The final communication from a woman who had spent 2 decades perfecting the art of disappearance. And for a burning, desperate moment, it felt like the only sane option. Take the book, take whatever cash she had, vanish into the American sprawl the way Jolene had vanished, become no one, go nowhere, let the Iron Reapers and the ATF chase each other in circles until they forgot her name. But running was her mother's answer. And her mother's answer had led to 19 years of motel rooms, empty refrigerators, and a daughter who grew up believing she was unlovable. Cassidy did not want to run. She wanted to fight. She just did not know who to fight for. Slipping out of the Taurus, Cassidy moved through the shadows with the silent desperation of a hunted animal. She knew the back alleys between the warehouse district and the garage. She knew which streetlights were broken and which chain-link fences had gaps large enough to slide through. 3 blocks. That was all that separated her from Blackstone Motors. She also knew the blind spots of the security cameras Flint had installed the previous month. She had helped Sledge mount them holding the brackets while he drilled into the cinder block. She knew the loose panel near the ventilation shaft in the back alley, the one that Sledge had been meaning to fix for weeks but never got around to. Within 10 minutes, Cassidy had shimmied through the vent and dropped onto a stack of discarded tires in the rear storage bay. The garage was different in the dead of night. The sharp tang of solvents and ozone hung heavier in the still air. The motorcycles lined up in the bays looked like sleeping animals, their chrome dull without the fluorescent lights to make them gleam. She crept up the metal staircase to her apartment. Inside, she grabbed a dark canvas duffel bag and shoved her few possessions into it. 3 pairs of jeans, a handful of shirts, her heavy work boots. The $300 in cash she had managed to save from her weekly pay. It was not enough to disappear, but it was enough to get her out of California and buy a few days to figure out what came next. Bag over her shoulder, she descended back to the shop floor. Her eyes settled on the midnight blue Sportster 883 parked near the rear exit. The bike Tate had used to teach her clutch control in the alley. The keys were kept in a magnetic lockbox on the wall beside the fire extinguisher. She knew the combination. 3 turns of the dial, click. She grabbed the keys. Her heart was a war drum, each beat sending a pulse of adrenaline through her limbs that made her fingers shake and her vision sharpen to a needlepoint. She was stealing from the Iron Reapers. If they caught her, there would be no conversation, no explanation, no mercy. She rolled the Sportster toward the heavy rear exit, the rubber tires whispering against the concrete. She reached for the iron latch. A massive hand clamped down on her shoulder. The grip was like a steel vise, immovable and absolute. Cassidy gasped and spun, dropping the duffel bag. She reached for the heavy crescent wrench on the nearest workbench. But another hand caught her wrist midair and pinned it to her side, with the effortless authority of a man who could crush the bones he was holding without changing his breathing. Sledge. His towering silhouette materialized from the darkness like a mountain that had been standing there the whole time waiting for the earth to notice it. He was not wearing his grease-stained coveralls. He wore his leather-cut the barbed wire skull glaring in the dim emergency lighting. "Going somewhere, kid?" His voice was a low rumble barely louder than the hum of the refrigerator in the break room. "Let me go, Sledge." Cassidy hissed, her voice tight with controlled panic. She struggled against his grip, but it was like trying to move a building. "I'm leaving. You can tell Flint I ran. Tell him you didn't see me. Tell him whatever you want." Sledge did not move. He looked down at her, his dark eyes unreadable behind the curtain of his thick beard. "You're stealing club property, Cassidy. That's a bad move for a smart girl." "I don't care about the club." The words came out raw, torn from a place inside her that she had been guarding since the moment she heard Harlan's voice in the darkness. "I heard them tonight. Down by my car, Harlan and Tate. I know what they're looking for. I know Flint is just using me to find my father's ledger so he can hand it over to the ATF and save himself." Sledge's grip on her wrist loosened. Not completely, but enough for the blood to flow back into her fingers. His brow furrowed beneath the brim of his bandana. You heard Harlan say that... Yes, he told Tate that Flint protects the club first, that legacy or not, nobody is bigger than the patch, that they need to handle it in-house. Cassidy pulled her arm free and took a step back. She unzipped her jacket and pulled the black waterproof pouch out just enough for Sledge to see it. The leather of the notebook caught the faint light. Well, I found it. My mother hid it in the fuse box of the car. It's everything Caldwell wants and everything the club is afraid of. If you're going to kill me for it, just do it now. But don't lie to me anymore. I'm done being lied to. Sledge stared at the pouch. The silence between them was suffocating heavy with the weight of 2 decades of secrets and the acrid ghost of burnt bridges. For one terrifying heartbeat, Cassidy believed the giant mechanic would simply reach out and snap her neck. It would be easy for him. He could do it with one hand. Instead, Sledge let out a long, exhausted sigh. He reached up and rubbed his face with both hands, and when his hands dropped, he looked 10 years older than he had a moment ago. You're half right, kid. His voice was quiet, almost gentle, a tone she had never heard from him. Harlan is looking for the ledger, but he ain't doing it for Flint. He's doing it to save his own skin. Cassidy froze. What? Agent Caldwell has been squeezing Harlan for 6 months on a separate RICO charge, Sledge explained, leaning against the workbench. The metal groaned under his weight. Conspiracy, racketeering, the kind of charges that put a man away for 20 years. Harlan's looking at growing old in a federal cell, and he's terrified. He's been trying to broker a deal with the ATF, the ledger for full immunity. If Harlan gets his hands on that book, he doesn't just save himself. He burns the entire Oakland charter to the ground, every patch member, every prospect, every business we've built. And he'll probably put you in the ground, too, just to make sure there are no witnesses. But Harlan said Flint wanted it. Harlan was feeding Tate poison. Sledge's voice hardened, testing the kid, seeing where his loyalties fell. If Tate ran to Flint with what Harlan told him, Harlan would know he couldn't trust the prospect. So he told Tate a version of the truth that made Flint look like the enemy. Classic rat move. Turn the young blood against leadership so nobody's watching the real traitor. Then what does Flint want? Flint doesn't know Harlan has flipped, Sledge said. Flint told us to keep an eye on you because he knew Caldwell was circling and he was terrified the feds would grab you off the street and use you as leverage. That's it. Flint never wanted the ledger. He wanted it buried. He wanted it to stay in whatever hole your mother put it in so that nobody, not the feds and not the club, would ever have a reason to come after you. Cassidy's legs felt like they might give out. She leaned against the Sportster, the cool metal of the gas tank pressing against her hip. The world was spinning again the same way it had spun in Flint's office when he told her about Wraith. But this time it was worse, because this time she had almost run. She had almost taken the nuclear weapon in her jacket and carried it out into the California night where Harlan or Caldwell or both would have found her before sunrise. Why should I believe you? She whispered. Sledge pushed himself off the workbench. He stood to his full height, and in the dim emergency lighting he looked less like a man and more like something carved from the earth itself. He reached up and touched the center of his chest right where the Death's Head patch was stitched to his leather vest. Because I've worn this patch for 22 years, he said. And in 22 years I've never lied to a brother's kid. Wraith saved my life once. Did you know that before you were born? A deal went bad in Stockton and I took a bullet meant for somebody else. Wraith carried me 6 blocks to a truck and drove me to a doctor who didn't ask questions. I owe him a debt that can never be paid. And looking after you is the closest I'll ever get. He picked up her dropped duffel bag and tossed it onto a nearby work table. Then he pointed a massive calloused finger toward the steel door that led to the clubhouse and Flint's office. You want to run, I can't stop you. Not really. You're fast and you're smart and you'd be in Nevada before we found the empty lockbox. But if you run now on a stolen bike carrying that book, you become a liability to everyone. The club will have to hunt you, Caldwell will hunt you, and Harlan will hunt you, and unlike the rest of us, he won't be looking to bring you home. He took a step toward the door. Or you go in there. You put that book on Flint's desk. You tell him exactly what you heard his Patch brother saying. And we handle this right now. Together, as a family. The word hung in the air between them. Family. It was the most dangerous word in the English language. It was the word that had broken her mother. The word that had put her father in a cell. The word that Flint had pressed against her heart with his scarred knuckles. It was also the word that had fed her when she was starving, sheltered her when she was freezing, and stood between her and a man who wanted to drag her out by her hair. Cassidy looked at the Sportster. Freedom. Escape. The open road and the anonymous darkness and the chance to disappear the way Jolene had disappeared, running from everything until there was nothing left to run from. She could be in Reno by morning, Phoenix by tomorrow night. She could become another ghost on a highway that was already crowded with them. Then she looked at the steel door, the unknown, the risk, the terrifying possibility that Sledge was telling the truth, and that the family she had almost abandoned was the only thing standing between her and annihilation. And beyond the risk, something else. Something she was ashamed to admit she wanted. The chance that she mattered to these men not because of what she carried in her jacket, but because of who she was. She had spent her entire life being left behind. Maybe the bravest thing she could do was stay. She zipped her jacket. She left the Sportster where it stood. "Let's go," she said. The hallway leading to Flint's office felt a mile long. Cassidy walked slightly behind Sledge, the giant man acting as a physical shield between her and her own paralyzing fear. The corridor was narrow, lined with framed photographs of club runs and poker nights and men standing beside their machines with the stiff pride of soldiers posing before a deployment. Some of the faces in the photographs were younger versions of men she knew. Some belonged to men she would never meet. Every photograph was a record of a world that existed outside the law, and every smile in every frame carried the quiet understanding that the price of admission was everything you had. Light spilled from beneath Flint's office door, cutting a sharp yellow line across the dark linoleum floor. Sledge did not bother knocking. He pushed the heavy door open, the hinges groaning in protest. Flint sat behind his scarred wooden desk. A half-empty bottle of cheap bourbon stood at his right hand. In front of him, spread across the desktop in neat rows, were the disassembled components of a Glock 19. The blue steel caught the lamplight. He was cleaning it the way some men pace or smoke or pray. It was the thing his hands did when his mind would not be still. He looked up. His cold blue eyes locked onto Cassidy, then shifted to Sledge. The muscle in his jaw flexed. "It's 3 in the morning, Sledge. Why is the kid out of bed? And why does she look like she's about to bolt?" "Because she was." Sledge stepped into the room and closed the door firmly behind them. The sound was final. "I caught her trying to hotwire the blue Sportster." Flint stood slowly. He placed both hands flat on the desk, the way a man does when he's deciding whether to stay calm or flip the table. "Is that true, Mercer?" Cassidy did not shrink. She did not hide behind Sledge. She walked directly up to the desk, unzipped her jacket, pulled out the black waterproof pouch, and unzipped it. She placed Wraith Mercer's leather-bound notebook on the wood right next to the disassembled pistol. "That's 20 years of your dirty laundry," Cassidy said. Her voice trembled, but her chin was up and her eyes were locked on his. Payoffs, routes, names, judges, cops, every dollar that went where it shouldn't have. The exact thing my father spent his life protecting, and the exact thing Agent Caldwell was willing to burn this entire organization to get. Flint stared at the notebook as if it were a live grenade resting on his desk between the bourbon and the gun oil. The color drained from his face. Slowly, with the reverence of a man handling a holy relic, he reached out and opened the cover. He recognized the handwriting immediately. The tight, angular letters of a man he had ridden with, fought beside, and mourned. "Where did you get this?" Flint breathed. "My mother hid it in the fuse box of my car," Cassidy answered. "She's been sitting on it for 19 years, but that doesn't matter right now. What matters is that Harlan and Tate were searching the lot by my car an hour ago. Harlan is planning to hand this book over to Agent Caldwell to buy his way out of a RICO charge. He's been flipped Flint. He's a rat." Flint's head snapped up from the notebook. His eyes, which had been soft with the grief of reading a dead man's handwriting, hardened into something Cassidy had never seen before. It was not anger. Anger was human and hot and temporary. This was colder. This was the look of a man who had just been told that the fire in his house had been set by someone sleeping under his roof. Harlan? The name fell from Flint's mouth like a stone dropping into a well. No echo, just depth. "He's a rat boss," Sledge confirmed from the doorway, his arms crossed over his massive chest. Kid heard him talking. "Harlan told Tate that you were planning to use Cassidy to find the book and then cut her loose when you were done. He's been turning the young blood against you to cover his own exit. Classic deflection." And the silence in the office was a living thing. It pressed against the walls. It squeezed the air from the room. In the world of the Iron Reapers there was no sin greater than turning informant. It was the ultimate betrayal. The unforgivable act. In some charters it carried a sentence that no appeals court could overturn. Flint looked down at the ledger. Then he looked at Cassidy. The exhaustion on his face was stripped away, replaced by something sharp and certain. "You could have taken this to Caldwell," Flint said quietly. "You could have bought yourself a new life. A new name. Witness protection. A clean start somewhere far from this garage and these men and all the dirt we've buried." Cassidy thought about the cold nights in the Taurus. The starvation. The absolute annihilating isolation of being 19 years old with no one in the world who knew where she was or cared if she woke up in the morning. Then she thought about the breakfast burritos Sledge brought her on cold mornings, the writing lessons in the alley, the weight of Flint's hand on her shoulder when he gave her the brass key to the apartment, the way Tate had laughed when he found the grease in his boots, the way the garage hummed beneath her feet at night like a heartbeat she had learned to sleep to. "Because Caldwell isn't my family," Cassidy said. "You are." And Flint held her gaze for a long, heavy moment. Then he reached across the desk and grabbed the bottle of bourbon. He did not pour a glass. He unscrewed the cap and took a single long pull, then set the bottle down with a decisive thud. "Sledge." His voice was sharp now. Command mode. The grief and the doubt were locked away in whatever vault he kept them in. "Call the sergeant-at-arms. Get the inner circle out of bed and down to the church room. Immediately. Nobody else. Do not wake Harlan. And do not wake Tate." "Done." Sledge was already pulling a heavy burner phone from inside his vest. Flint picked up the ledger and held it out to Cassidy. She stared at it confused. "What are you doing? Wraith left this for your mother to buy her safety. It belongs to you." Flint reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a heavy chrome Zippo lighter. He tossed it to her. Cassidy caught it with one hand, the metal cold and solid against her palm. "The feds are going to come for this building the second Harlan realizes that book is gone," Flint said. He was already reassembling the Glock on his desk with the blind, automatic precision of a man who could do it in his sleep. The barrel clicked into the slide. The recoil spring compressed. The magazine slid home. "I'm going to deal with the rat in my house, but I can't protect you if that book exists. Caldwell will never stop. The ATF will never stop tearing your life apart looking for it. As long as those pages are intact, you have a target on your back that no patch and no gun can remove." Cassidy looked down at the notebook in her hands. The weight of it was different now. It was not just paper and leather. It was the only physical proof that her father had existed. His handwriting, his words, his record of a life lived outside the lines. Destroying it meant erasing the last tangible piece of the man she had never known. "Destroying this means the feds have nothing on the club," Cassidy said. "It means you are safe," Flint corrected. He racked the slide of the Glock with a sharp metallic clack and holstered the weapon. He walked around the desk and stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could see the individual threads of gray in his beard and the fine web of scars on his hands. "You burned that book, Mercer, and there is no going back to the civilian world. You erase the only leverage you have, the only bargaining chip. You do this, and you are tied to Blackstone Motors, to me, to Sledge, and to the Iron Reapers for the rest of your natural life. There's no exit, no retirement, no witness protection, just the club." His blue eyes held hers, demanding absolute certainty, demanding that she understand with every cell in her body the permanence of what she was about to do. "Are you ready to be a ghost, kid?" Cassidy looked at the Zippo in her hand. She flipped the lid. The sharp snick echoed in the small office like the cocking of a hammer. She struck the flint. The small yellow flame leapt to life, its light dancing across the walls and the photographs and the face of the man who had given her a home. She held the flame beneath the edge of the leather cover. The heat curled the material inward, and the first page caught fire, the cramped handwriting of Wraith Mercer dissolving into orange light. "I was already a ghost," Cassidy said, watching her father's words turn to ash. "Now I'm just home. The smell of burning history was acrid and thick. It filled Flint's office like incense in a cathedral, the smoke curling toward the ceiling tiles in slow, deliberate spirals. Cassidy watched the heavy vellum pages of Wraith Mercer's ledger curl into blackened flakes inside a metal trash can that Flint had placed on the concrete floor between them. The fire consumed decades of names, dates, dollar amounts, routes, and payoff schedules. The entire DNA of the Oakland Charter's survival turned to gray ash in the span of minutes. She watched her father's handwriting dissolve. The tight, angular letters that she had read for the first time only hours ago, the only sample of his penmanship she would ever see, the closest thing to hearing his voice that she would ever experience, disappearing into orange flame and white smoke. She tried to memorize the way the ink looked before the fire took it, the slight leftward slant, the way he crossed his T's with a sharp, decisive stroke, the way he wrote her mother's name, Jolene, in the margin of one page with a softness that was absent from every other word in the book. Those were the last details to vanish. The soft handwriting. The private tenderness of a hard man writing a woman's name in the margin of his crimes. With every page that caught fire, Cassidy felt a weight lifting from her shoulders, but something new settled into its place. Not lighter, different. A cold iron certainty that she had crossed a threshold and the door behind her had sealed shut. She was no longer a victim of her past. She was the architect of the club's future silence. the keeper of a fire that could never be unburned. Flint stood by the window, his silhouette framed by the flickering neon sign of the garage outside. The red light pulsed against his profile, painting his face in alternating bands of shadow and crimson. He was not watching the fire, he was watching the street. His eyes moved with the slow, predatory patience of a man who had spent decades reading the darkness for threats. Sledge has the inner circle in the back, as Flint said, his voice stripped of emotion, flat, operational. Harlan thinks he's coming in for a standard Betrayal briefing on the charity toy run. Tate is with him. He paused. That kid is young. Cassidy. Impressionable. If he chose the rat over the patch tonight, I can't save him. Tate isn't a rat, Cassidy said, her voice cracking against the dryness of the smoke. He was just listening. He didn't know what Harlan was doing. Flint turned from the window. His eyes were hard as flint, true to the name he had earned decades ago. In this life, listening to treason without reporting it is the same as committing it. He picked up his holstered Glock from the desk and clipped it to his belt. Stay here. If you hear shots, you go out the window, take the Sportster, and you don't stop riding until you hit the Nevada border. You understand me? Cassidy nodded, her throat tight. Flint exited the office. The heavy thud of his boots echoed down the hallway toward the church room, the reinforced inner sanctum where the Iron Reapers conducted their most sacred and their most terrible business. The sound grew fainter. A door opened. A door closed. Then silence. Minutes felt like hours. Cassidy sat in the worn leather chair in the dark office, the embers in the trash can glowing like angry red eyes in a cave. The smoke drifted in lazy patterns. The clock on the wall ticked with a mechanical indifference that made her want to tear it from its nail. Each tick was a second in which anything could happen behind that heavy door. A gunshot, a scream, the sound of a body hitting the floor. The silence between the ticks was worse than the ticks themselves, because the silence was where her imagination lived, and her imagination was showing her every possible outcome, each one more violent than the last. She looked around the office. At the framed photograph on Flint's desk that she had never noticed before, turned slightly away from visitors. A young woman with dark hair and a wide smile standing next to a motorcycle with a man who was unmistakably a younger Flint before the gray in his beard and the deep lines around his eyes. Madeline, the daughter who did not come home from college. The ghost that lived in the space between every word Flint spoke and every silence he let stretch too long. Cassidy understood something in that moment. Flint had not taken her in because of Wraith. Not entirely. He had taken her in because loss had hollowed out a space inside him that nothing else could fill. And when Cassidy walked through his door soaking wet and starving and stubborn, she had fit into that space like a key into a lock that had been waiting years to be turned. She could not stay in the chair. Her loyalty would not allow it. Whatever was happening in that room, it was happening because she had walked into this garage, because she had found the ledger, because she had chosen to bring it to Flint instead of to Caldwell or to the highway. This was her storm. She could not sit in a dry room and listen to the thunder. She crept down the hallway, her back pressed against the cold cinder block wall, her breathing shallow and controlled. The photographs of old club runs watched her past the men in the frames, frozen in moments of joy and brotherhood that felt impossibly distant from the violence coiling in the air tonight. The door to the church room was cracked open. An inch, maybe two. Enough for the light to spill into the corridor and for the sounds within to reach her ears with terrible clarity. Inside the air was electric. Harlan was pinned against the heavy mahogany meeting table, his arms wrenched behind his back. Sledge's massive hand was wrapped around his throat, not squeezing hard enough to kill, but hard enough to make every breath a negotiation. The veins in Harlan's temples bulged. His shaved head was slick with sweat. His boots scraped uselessly against the floor, searching for leverage that did not exist. The church room was a windowless, wood-paneled space that smelled like cigars and leather and the accumulated tension of 1,000 decisions made behind a locked door. The long mahogany table at the center was scarred with cigarette burns and ring marks from decades of glasses set down during debates that decided the fate of men. On the far wall hung the Charter's original flag, the Death's Head on a field of black, flanked by framed photographs of founding members, most of whom were dead or in prison. Two other patched members, Briggs and Nolan, stood at the door like sentinels. Their faces were blank, professional. They had been through this before. The club had survived informants and traitors and federal investigations, and the protocol for dealing with each was as old as the organization itself. Tate was in the corner, slumped in a wooden chair. His face was the color of old paper. His hands trembled in his lap. The full patch he had earned only weeks ago looked somehow heavier on his shoulders, as if the leather had absorbed the weight of what he was witnessing. Flint stood over Harlan, holding the empty black waterproof pouch that Cassidy had found in the car. He held it the way a prosecutor holds the murder weapon. Close enough for the accused to see it, far enough to be out of reach. "Looking for this Harlan?" Flint asked. His voice was a whisper. In the enclosed space of the church room, the whisper carried more weight than a shout. Harlan gasped against Sledge's grip, the muscles in his neck straining. "Flint, listen to me. The feds had me cornered. They had physical evidence. They were going to put me away for life. I did what I had to do. We all take that risk when we put on the cut." Flint's voice erupted from the whisper into a roar that bounced off the wood-paneled walls. He slammed his fist into the mahogany table. The sound was like a cannon shot. A drinking glass that had been sitting near the edge toppled and shattered on the floor. "You were going to sell out a dead brother's daughter. You were going to hand over Wraith's legacy to Agent Caldwell just so you could sleep in a federal bed instead of a federal cell." "I did it for the club," Harlan wheezed. "That book was a liability. As long as it existed, every man in this room was one search warrant away from prison. I was going to intercept it, destroy it. I was trying to protect us." "Liar!" Flint spat the word like venom. He turned to Tate. The young man in the corner flinched as if the gaze itself carried a physical sting. "And you heard him talking about betraying a brother's daughter. You stood in that parking lot and listened to a patched member discuss selling this club to the feds, and you didn't come to me. Why—" Tate looked up. There were tears on his face. Not the tears of a man who was afraid. The tears of a man who was ashamed. "I didn't think he was serious, Flint. He's a patched brother. I'm just a new patch. I thought I was misreading it. I thought he was testing me." "He was testing you," Flint said. The anger drained from his voice, replaced by something worse. Disappointment, the kind that lands heavier than any fist. "And you failed." Flint looked at Sledge and nodded once. The giant man released his grip. Harlan slumped to the floor, coughing violently, his hands going to his bruised throat. He tried to speak, but the words came out as a ragged, wet whisper that no one in the room cared to hear. "Strip him!" Flint commanded. Briggs and Nolan stepped forward. They moved with clinical practiced efficiency, the way surgeons move when the diagnosis is terminal and there is nothing left but the procedure. They seized Harlan's arms and hauled him to his feet. The man who had stood in this room as a brother for 15 years, who had voted on club business and ridden in formation and sworn the same oath as every other man wearing the death's head, was now something else entirely. He was the worst thing a man could become in this world. He was a traitor. Briggs grabbed the collar of Harlan's leather vest and ripped it downward. The stitching tore with a sound that made Cassidy's stomach turn. It sounded like skin tearing, like something organic being separated from something alive. Nolan pulled the Iron Reaper's patches from the denim one by one. The Death's Head, the Oakland Rocker, the 1%er Diamond, the club name across the top. Each patch was removed with a deliberate ceremonial slowness that transformed the act from punishment into ritual. Each tear was a sentence. Each rip was a word and in a judgment that had no appeal. In the world of outlaw motorcycle clubs, this was the ultimate execution, not of the body but of the identity. A man without his patch was a man without a country, without a name, without the protection and the purpose that had defined every waking moment of his life since the day he first threw a leg over a motorcycle and rode into the Brotherhood. Harlan stood in the center of the room in a plain denim vest, his patches scattered on the floor around his feet like the feathers of a bird that had been plucked alive. The man who had been a patched Iron Reaper for 15 years was gone. What stood in his place was something smaller, something hollow, a man-shaped void where a brother used to be. "You have 1 hour to get out of Oakland." Flint said, his voice carrying the weight and the finality of a judge reading a sentence. "If I see your face in Northern California after sunrise, the feds won't be the ones you need to worry about. You're out. Bad standing, no contact, no communication, no assistance from any charter, any member, or any associate of this organization. As far as the Iron Reapers are concerned, you are dead. Do you understand?" Harlan looked around the room, at Sledge, who stared back with the flat, emotionless gaze of a man who could crush him like an insect and who would sleep soundly afterward. At Briggs and Nolan, who had already turned their backs, the universal gesture of erasure. At Tate, who could not meet his eyes, because meeting them would mean acknowledging that the man he had listened to in the dark parking lot, the man whose whispered poison had almost turned him against his own president, was not a strategist or a survivor, but a coward who had sold his soul to save his skin. At the patches on the floor that no one would pick up, because no one would touch the colors of a traitor. They would be burned later after he was gone. The leather and the thread and the ink would turn to ash, the same way Wraith's ledger had turned to ash, and the smoke would carry the last trace of Harlan's existence in the Iron Reapers up through the roof and into the Oakland sky, where it would dissipate into nothing. Harlan opened his mouth as if to speak. No sound came out. There was nothing left to say. Every argument had been made and rejected. Every excuse had been weighed and found hollow. He was standing in a room full of men who had been willing to go to prison, who had been willing to die rather than betray the Brotherhood. And he had chosen himself over all of them. That choice was irrevocable. That choice was who he was now. Harlan scrambled for the door. He moved like a man fleeing a burning building, his steps clumsy and frantic, his hands grasping at the doorframe for balance. The sound of his boots faded down the hallway through the shop and out into the Oakland night. A car engine started. Tires spun on wet gravel, then silence. Flint turned to Tate. The young man stood his body rigid, his new patch suddenly feeling like an anchor around his neck. "You—" Flint said, his voice quieter now, but no less cutting. "I've got a lot of floors to sweep, kid. You're back to prospect status. You earn that patch again from scratch, or you follow Harlan out that door. There is no third option. Do you understand?" Tate nodded. The relief on his face was visible, but so was the pain. He had been given a second chance, but the cost of it was carved into his expression like a scar that would take years to fade. He would carry the weight of this night for the rest of his time in the club. Every floor he swept, every tool he organized, every menial task he performed on his way back to the patch would be a reminder that he had stood in a parking lot at 2 a.m. and listened to a traitor speak treason. Instead of walking straight to Flint's door, he had done nothing. The nothing was the heaviest thing he would ever carry. "Yes, Flint, I understand." As the men began to clear out, filing through the door with the heavy, silent gravity of soldiers leaving a battlefield, Flint caught Cassidy's eye through the crack in the door. He knew she had been watching. He had probably known since the moment she left the office. He did not smile. He did not offer a comforting word. He simply raised his fist and tapped his knuckles against the center of his chest right over his heart. Cassidy pressed her palm against the same spot on her own chest. A silent oath. A language that needed no words. The rat was gone. But the storm was only half over. The sun began to bleed over the Oakland skyline, casting long, jagged orange shadows across the rooftops and the industrial cranes that stood along the waterfront like the skeletons of prehistoric birds. Inside Blackstone Motors, the air was heavy. Not just with the lingering acrid scent of Wraith's burnt ledger, but with the weight of a secret that now bound every person in the building to a single unspoken oath. The ledger was gone. It had never existed. And anyone who said otherwise was a liar or a dead man. Cassidy sat on a stool at the back workbench, meticulously cleaning a set of specialized torque wrenches. Her fingers moved in rhythm, scrubbing each tool with the care and precision of a ritual. She was not just cleaning tools, she was grounding herself. The adrenaline that had carried her through the night was receding like a tide, and what it left behind was a cold, crystalline clarity. She had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. She had destroyed evidence. She had aided in the expulsion of a man from the only life he knew. She had chosen the Iron Reapers over the United States government, and the choice was permanent. At exactly 7 a.m, the familiar unwelcome hum of a high-performance engine vibrated through the open bay doors. Agent Caldwell did not announce himself with a siren or a phone call. He stepped out of a black government sedan before it had fully stopped, followed by 4 men in tactical windbreakers with the yellow letters ATF emblazoned across the back. They moved through the parking lot with the practiced arrogance of men who believed they held the winning hand. Caldwell did not wait for an invitation. He kicked the side pedestrian door open so hard the metal handle punched a hole in the interior drywall. The sound echoed through the garage like a starter pistol. "Search warrant!" Caldwell announced, his voice bouncing off the corrugated steel ceiling. He slapped a folded document onto the nearest red tool chest, right next to a puddle of spilled transmission fluid. "We have probable cause to believe that stolen government property and evidence of a criminal conspiracy are being harbored on these premises. Specifically the personal records of one Wraith Mercer deceased." Flint did not move from his position by the office door. He held a ceramic mug of black coffee, the steam curling around his weathered face. He looked at the warrant with the same expression a man might give a piece of junk mail. "You're early, Caldwell, but if you're looking for a tour, we're a law-abiding business. Feel free to look around. Just don't touch the chrome with those greasy government fingers. It's a nightmare to get the prints off." The agents moved through the garage like a swarm. They tossed the meticulously organized parts bins, scattering nuts and bolts and washers across the concrete floor in a metallic rain. They ripped open the lockers, throwing personal effects, spare leather vests, and family photographs into heaps. One agent pulled every drawer from Flint's desk and dumped the contents onto the floor. Another went through the break room, emptying the refrigerator, checking behind the microwave, and tearing the paper towel dispenser off the wall to inspect the cavity behind it. 2 agents headed straight for the metal staircase, their boots ringing on each step as they disappeared into Cassidy's studio apartment. She could hear them overhead. The thud of her mattress being flipped against the wall. The crash of her small dresser being dragged away from its corner. The hollow hammering as they tested every floorboard for hidden compartments. They opened the bathroom cabinet and pulled out every bottle in the tube and dropped them into the sink. They checked the plumbing under the hot plate. They inspected every ventilation duct, unscrewing the grills and shining flashlights into the dark shafts beyond. They looked inside the toilet tank. They even pulled the cover off the single electrical outlet to see if anything had been taped behind the faceplate. Every invasion was a message. We can reach you anywhere. We can touch everything you own. There is no corner of your life that is beyond our authority. Cassidy did not look up from her workbench. She continued cleaning the torque wrenches with the steady, rhythmic precision of a woman who had nothing to hide and all the time in the world. But beneath the calm exterior, she was cataloging every sound, every footstep, every drawer being opened and slammed shut. She was recording the shape of the government's desperation, and it told her everything she needed to know. They had nothing. If they had evidence, they would not be tearing the building apart looking for it. This was not a search, it was a tantrum. Caldwell walked across the bay and stopped at her workbench. He leaned over her shoulder close enough that she could smell the peppermint gum he was chewing and the stale coffee on his breath and the particular desperation of a man whose career was riding on a piece of evidence that no longer existed. "Where is it, Cassidy?" He asked, his voice low and hard. "We know you went to the car at 2 a.m. Our surveillance unit watched you. We know you removed a black pouch from the vehicle. This is your last chance to be a victim in this story instead of an accomplice. Hand over the ledger and I can still get you into witness protection. New name, new city, a life that doesn't smell like gasoline every day." Cassidy stopped scrubbing. She set the wrench down carefully, aligned it with the others on the bench, and looked up at him. Her eyes were calm, completely calm. The calm of a lake on a windless morning. The calm of a woman who had looked into the fire and decided she was not afraid of it. "I don't know what you're talking about, Agent Caldwell. I went to my car because I couldn't sleep. I was looking for some old photographs of my mother. Sentimental reasons. It's a piece of junk sitting on an abandoned lot. If there was ever a pouch in there, someone must have stolen it a long time ago. You know how the neighborhood is." Caldwell's jaw clenched so tight she could hear his teeth grinding. He reached out his hand, hovering near her shoulder the way a man hovers his hand over a stove to test if it is hot enough to burn. But he caught Flint's gaze from across the room. Flint had not moved. He had not spoken. He was simply standing there with his coffee, watching Caldwell with the patient, unblinking focus of a predator that had already decided the outcome of the hunt and was simply waiting for the prey to realize it. Caldwell withdrew his hand. After 3 hours, the lead tactical agent emerged from the staircase, shaking his head. "Nothing, sir. We checked the vents, the plumbing, the subflooring, and every cavity in the building. It's clean." The frustration on Caldwell's face darkened to a mottled purple that started at his collar and climbed toward his thinning hairline. He turned back to Cassidy, his voice dropping to a hiss meant only for her. "You're playing a dangerous game, kid. These men are not your friends. They're not your family. They're a criminal enterprise, and you are a 19-year-old girl who is in way over her head. You think you're one of them? You think that because they taught you to change brake pads and gave you a room with a hot plate, you're protected. Protection in this world is conditional. It lasts exactly as long as you're useful, and when you stop being useful when the next crisis comes and they need a sacrifice, you'll be the one they put on the altar. Because you're the one with no patch, no vote, no standing." He straightened up, adjusting his tie with a quick, irritated motion. "Come with me right now voluntarily, and I can still make this right. I can give you a name, a school, and a life where you don't have to wake up every morning wondering if today is the day they decide you know too much." Cassidy wiped her hands on a grease-stained rag. She stood up from the stool. She was not tall, she was not physically imposing, but something had changed in the way she occupied space. She stood differently, rooted, present, the way the men around her stood. As if the ground beneath her feet belonged to her and anyone who wanted to take it would have to bring more than a badge and a warrant. The girl who had walked into this garage 4 months ago shivering and hollow-cheeked and desperate would not have recognized the woman standing at this workbench. That girl had been looking for a place to hide. This woman was not hiding from anything. She did not look at Flint for permission. She did not glance at Sledge for reassurance. She did not check the room to see if anyone was watching. She had spent 19 years waiting for someone to tell her what to do, where to go, who to be. That era was over. The ledger was ash. The choice had been made, and the woman who had made it was standing on her own 2 feet for the first time in her life. She spoke for herself. "I'm already protected," Cassidy said. Her voice was clear and strong, cutting through the ambient noise of the garage like a blade through fog. She reached up with her left hand and slowly rolled back the sleeve of her work shirt, exposing the pale skin of her inner forearm. There in fresh black ink that was still slightly raised and tender against her skin was a tattoo. It was not the full death's head insignia of the Iron Reapers. That was a mark earned through years of service and blood. This was something different. A pair of spectral wings, delicate but fierce, spread wide as if in flight, and in the center, in clean classic lettering, a single word, Wraith. It was a legacy mark, an indelible declaration that she was not an employee, not an associate, not a passing guest. She was blood. She was the daughter of a man who had given everything to protect the Brotherhood, and the Brotherhood had accepted the debt. Sledge had done the work himself in the quiet hours before dawn while Flint dealt with Harlan, using a tattoo gun he kept in a locked drawer beneath his welding station. The needle had hurt. The ink burned as it settled into her skin, but the pain was a sacrament. It was the price of a permanence. It was the cost of belonging to something that could not be taken away by a landlord or a mother or a federal agent with a search warrant and a bad attitude. Caldwell stared at the ink. The finality of it registered in his eyes like the sound of a vault door slamming shut. She watched his face cycle through recognition, disbelief, and finally the cold, calculating resignation of a man doing math and arriving at a number he did not like. In the world of outlaw motorcycle clubs, that mark was more than a tattoo. It was a treaty. It meant that Cassidy Mercer was under the permanent, unconditional protection of the Iron Reaper's charter. To detain her, to threaten her, to so much as raise a voice in her direction was not a legal matter. It was an act of war. And the ATF was not prepared to fight a war over a notebook that had turned to ash in a trash can 6 hours ago. "We're done here!" Caldwell barked to his team. His voice cracked on the second word, the sound of a man whose certainty had been gutted. "Pack it up!" He turned back to Flint, pointing a trembling finger across the garage. "This isn't over. We'll be watching every motorcycle that leaves this lot. We'll be in your taxes. We'll be in your trash. We'll be in your rearview mirrors. Every time you take a breath, I want you to smell me." "Then I'll be sure to invest in some better air freshener," Flint replied. He took a sip of his coffee. He did not blink. Behind him, Sledge cracked his knuckles. The sound was casual and enormous, like a tree branch breaking in a quiet forest. The ATF vehicles peeled out of the lot tires, screeching against the wet asphalt in a petulant, impotent farewell. Caldwell's sedan was the last to leave. Through the rear window, Cassidy could see him on his phone, his free hand gesturing sharply, the body language of a man explaining a failure to someone who did not want to hear it. The car turned the corner and disappeared behind the auto body shop on the next block, and with it went the last visible thread connecting Cassidy Mercer to the federal investigation into the Iron Reapers. She knew it was not truly over. Caldwell would keep watching. He would file reports and request surveillance budgets and build new theories from the rubble of the old ones. But the ledger was ash. The rat was gone. And the girl he had tried to turn into an informant was standing in the bay of Blackstone Motors with fresh ink on her arm and grease on her hands, and she was not going anywhere. The silence that followed was different from the silence of the night. It was not tense. It was not heavy. It was the silence of aftermath. The silence of a storm that had spent itself and left the sky washed clean. The kind of silence that fills a house after a long illness is finally broken, and the first breath of clean air moves through the rooms like a benediction. Sledge was the first to break it. He slid out from under a lift on his creeper, his massive frame scraping against the concrete, and let out a booming laugh that bounced off every wall in the building. The look on his face when he saw the ink. "I thought that man was going to have a cardiac event right there on my shop floor. 20 years in federal law enforcement, and he got outplayed by a 19-year-old girl with a wrench and a tattoo." Briggs laughed from the parts cage, a rare sound from a man who typically communicated in nods and grunts. Nolan shook his head and allowed himself a grin that looked almost painful on his typically stoic face, as if the muscles responsible for smiling had not been used in so long they had forgotten the motion. Even Tate, who had been sweeping the front bay with the quiet, chastened diligence of a man earning his way back from disgrace, allowed himself a small, cautious smile. He caught Cassidy's eye from across the room and raised his broom in a mock salute. She nodded back. It was not forgiveness. Not yet. But it was the beginning of the road toward it. Flint walked over to Cassidy. He did not offer a hug. That was not the way of the Iron Reapers. Affection in this world was expressed in different currencies. A hand on the shoulder, a nod across a room. The quiet act of standing between someone and the thing trying to hurt them. He reached into the pocket of his vest and pulled out a small heavy object. He took Cassidy's hand, turned it palm up, and pressed the object into it. It was Wraith's brass Zippo, the one she had used to burn the ledger. Flint had spent the last hour polishing it, scrubbing the soot from every ridge and hinge until the brass gleamed like a gold coin. The initials WM were etched into the casing, nearly worn smooth by decades of use. The metal was warm from Flint's pocket, and it settled into Cassidy's palm with a weight that was disproportionate to its size. It was heavy the way a wedding ring is heavy. Heavy with meaning. Heavy with the compressed mass of a life lived and lost and now inherited. "You did more than save the club last night, Cassidy," Flint said. His voice was uncharacteristically soft. The granite had receded, and what lay beneath was something she had seen only once before in the office when he told her about Madeline. You honored a man who spent 20 years in the dark so the rest of us could stay in the light. Wraith would have been proud of who you became last night. Not because of the fire, because of the choice. You had every reason to run and you stayed. You had every reason to sell us out and you didn't. That's not legacy, Cassidy, that's character. And character can't be inherited, it has to be built. He let go of her hand. The Zippo sat warm in her palm, the brass absorbing the heat of her skin. You're a part of this now, Flint continued. Not because of your last name. Not because of who your father was. Because of your spine. Because you walked into a room full of men who could have destroyed you and you put the truth on the table and dared them to deal with it. That's what earns a place in this shop. That's what earns a place in this family. Sledge walked over, wiping his hands on a shop rag. He clapped Cassidy on the back with a hand that felt like a warm sledgehammer, the impact sending a jolt through her entire body. Lunch is on the club today, kid. Ribs and cornbread at the shack down the street. You riding with us, or are you still working on that clutch control? Cassidy looked at the line of Harley-Davidsons standing in formation near the open bay doors. Their chrome caught the California sun that had broken through the morning clouds, throwing fractured light across the concrete floor like scattered diamonds. She looked at the men who had seen her at her lowest, starving and shivering and sleeping in a dead car, and who had given her the tools to stand back up. She looked at Tate, who was leaning on his broom with a hopeful, tentative expression, waiting to see if she would still speak to a man who had almost let her down. She looked at Sledge, whose enormous frame was already moving toward his own bike, his leather cut creaking as he swung a leg over the seat. She felt the weight of the Zippo in her jacket pocket. She felt the sting of the fresh ink on her forearm. She felt the vibration of the building beneath her feet, that constant, comforting hum that had become the rhythm of her life. She thought about her mother as she walked toward the bikes. Not with anger, not anymore. She thought about Jolene the way you think about a soldier who went missing in a war that nobody talks about. With sadness. With respect. With the quiet hope that wherever she was alive, and that somehow, across the distance and the silence, she would know that her daughter had found the thing she had spent 19 years running from and that it had not destroyed her. It had saved her. I'm riding, Cassidy said. She walked to the midnight blue Sportster 883. The bike she had once tried to steal in a moment of desperation and terror. It sat in the bay like it had been waiting for her, its handlebars angled slightly to the left, its tank still bearing the fingerprints she had left on it hours ago when she thought she was saying goodbye to everything. She threw her leg over the seat. She straightened her back, she kicked the stand up with the heel of her boot, and the bike settled beneath her weight with the familiar balance tilt that Tate had spent weeks teaching her to trust. She turned the ignition. She thumbed the starter. The engine roared to life. It was not a gentle sound. It was the sound of controlled combustion and forged steel and the mechanical heartbeat of a machine that had been built to move through the world on its own terms. The vibration traveled through the frame, up through the seat and into her body, settling in her chest like a second pulse. Flint was at the head of the formation. He looked back over his shoulder, his blue eyes catching the morning light, and gave a single short nod. The universal signal. Time to ride. The formation rolled out of the lot. Flint at the front, his posture relaxed, but his eyes scanning the road ahead with the constant vigilance of a man who knew that danger did not announce itself. Sledge at his right shoulder, his massive frame hunched over his road king like a boulder balanced on a bridge. Briggs and Nolan flanking, riding in the disciplined staggered formation that was as natural to these men as walking. Tate near the back, earning his position 1 mile at a time, his face set with the grim determination of a young man who understood the cost of a second chance and intended to pay it in full. And Cassidy riding in the center of the pack, surrounded by the thunder of engines and the wall of leather and chrome that had become her world. The Oakland streets opened up before them. The rain had stopped, the sun was out, the pavement was still wet and the tires hissed against the asphalt, throwing up fine mist that caught the light and turned it into tiny fleeting rainbows. People on the sidewalk stopped and stared, some with fear, some with fascination, some with the grudging respect that the world gives to anyone brave enough or foolish enough to live entirely on their own terms. Cassidy Mercer did not look back at Blackstone Motors. She did not need to. The garage was not behind her. It was inside her. The grease under her fingernails, the hum in her bones, the legacy mark on her arm, the Zippo in her pocket, the family riding beside her. She twisted the throttle and the Sportster surged forward, the engine's voice rising from a growl to a roar. The wind hit her face. The road stretched ahead wide and open and uncertain, the way every road is when you are 19 years old and you have finally stopped running. The formation moved through the streets of Oakland like a single organism, the engines harmonizing into a deep rolling thunder that echoed between the buildings and rattled the windows of parked cars. A UPS driver pulled to the side of the road and waited for them to pass his face, a mixture of annoyance and awe. A group of kids on a corner stopped their basketball game and watched their mouths open their eyes wide with the unfiltered wonder that only children can summon in the presence of something larger and louder than anything they have encountered before. Cassidy felt the pack around her like a living shield. The vibration of the engines traveled through the asphalt and up through the frame of the Sportster and into her bones, and for a single perfect moment everything that had happened over the past 4 months compressed into a feeling so intense it left no room for thought. The hunger, the cold, the fear, the grease and the chrome and the fire. The father she never met. The mother who loved her enough to leave. The man who gave her a key. The giant who brought her breakfast. The boy who put grease in his boots. All of it flowed through her like electricity through copper wire, and what emerged on the other side was something clean and bright and entirely her own. Cassidy Mercer had walked into Blackstone Motors as a ghost. Starving, abandoned, invisible. A girl with $3 in her pocket, and a mother who had vanished, and a name that meant nothing to anyone, least of all to herself. She had been tested by the work and the men and the code that governed their world. She had been confronted with the truth of her father's sacrifice and the impossible burden of his legacy. She had held in her hands the power to destroy everything or to protect it, and she had chosen fire. Not the fire of destruction. The fire of purification, the fire that burns away the dead wood so the living roots can breathe. By burning the ledger, she had not just saved the Iron Reapers. She had saved herself. She had proven that loyalty was not a word you said, but a bridge you built with your own hands and then walked across even when the water below was black and cold and you could not see the other side. She had proven that family was not a matter of blood or birth certificates or last names on a mailbox. Family was the breakfast burrito from a giant man who would never say I love you. Family was the brass key to a room with a lock on the door. Family was the sound of 5 men's boots on a concrete floor moving in unison toward the thing that had threatened their own. The motorcycle beneath her hummed. The road ahead was wide. The sun climbed higher over Oakland, burning through the last of the morning clouds, turning the bay into a sheet of hammered gold. Cassidy Mercer was not a ghost anymore. She was not a legacy. She was not a victim or a liability or an asset on a federal agent's whiteboard. She was a 19-year-old woman who had chosen her own name, her own family, and her own road. And for the first time in her life, the road led home.